Today, I am delighted to be joined by Florian Wupperfeld, who's the Chief Executive Officer of LCD Ventures, a UK-based agency specializing in place-based sustainability. Thank you for joining us today, Florian.
Thanks, Gareth, for having me.
We'll unpick some of those issues in a moment, but first, I'd like to start with the question, how did you first get involved in sustainability? And then how did your career develop from there?
Well, look, a lot of people are suddenly in sustainability, and I'm always wondering where it comes from. In my case, I was working in innovation, a lot around kind of cultural innovation, worked for BMW on their strategy on how to integrate their brand into kind of the kind of cultural context. But also it was about innovation and technology, how to deliver, communicate with clients. I worked for many, many years in the hospitality sector, Soho House Group. And I was also responsible for kind of creating partnerships a lot with cultural organizations and cultural institutions. And then I launched about 12 years ago a platform called Leading Culture Destinations, because I realized that if you talk to museums, they never think they're part of the tourism industry. And if you talk to tourism people, when you talk about museums, they're like, they're about education. So they're not really aligned. But if you look, for example, at London, 5 of the top 10 tourism destinations are museums. So there's actually a huge crossover, and we try to build that bridge between culture and tourism. We work with about 200 tourism boards. We have a YouTube channel, LCD, as youtube.com/LCD travel, where we promote new cultural destinations in particular, about their kind of cultural offering for travelers and people who are interested. And then I realized at some point that we not just talk about the museum itself and, the food, the shop, the exhibition and stuff like this, but like in a bigger scale, what impact does a museum have as a place for education on its local community, but also on its local economy? Because often, if you look at Bilbao, before the museum was built at the Guggenheim, they had 300,000 visitors at Bilbao, and now they have 5 million, which brought a completely new set of problems, obviously. But culture is a huge driver for traffic, for tourism, for the iconography of cities. And that's how we kind of then moved away from kind of being like tourism culture centric, more into kind of what is the social impact of culture? And then in the wider sense of how do you kind of create the kind of socially sustainable communities. For cities, we've launched in 2020 this ESG Innovation Collective, which is a collective now of 15 cities, Barcelona, Berlin, Hamburg, Amsterdam, to think about how to use ESG, and we come to that later, how this could be used to bring more money into kind of social projects in cities. And so suddenly I was somehow in the middle between the private sector who's after commercial growth, the cultural and social sector who needs kind of infrastructure, and cities and the public sector who is looking for kind of social sustainability. And I'm a little bit the translator, communicating between these very often kind of very controversial arguments and opinions and needs. And we are basically trying to kind of bring it together to create thriving cities.
Yeah. And, place-based and placemaking are sort of jargon that gets slung about a bit, but what does it mean in practice?
I mean, look, what does placemaking mean? It makes, one way to say it is you create basically a proposition which makes a place attractive to visit, that people feel like included, places people want to go to. I sometimes say, like, we create the software for the real estate hardware, So placemaking is really about kind of defining what a place is about, also looking at its history. How do you communicate it? How do you configure it? Everybody talks about mixed use right now, so not just offices anymore or housing. It's often kind of a combination between retail, education, medical, and what is the configuration there. And so placemaking is really about how do you make a place attractive that people go from A to B because of the value proposition.
Right. And I first got involved in environmental sustainability, or first got interested in it about the time of the Earth Summit in '92. And at that point, one of the slogans that came out of it was the Local Agenda 21, Think Global, Act Local. Now, how successful do you think that is? Do governments think local, or is it still very centralized in most countries?
Well, how many hours do you have? I mean, the thing is, think global, act local. I mean, one of the learnings we have learned, which, because you said like you're coming from the environmental angle,
Yeah.
is that the environmental agenda, and especially in ESG, that's a global perspective because the environment is for us all on our planet. What we do here affects the rainforest in South America. And if you pollute your with your factory here, where you blow out carbon, you can set off your carbon footprint by planting trees in Patagonia. So that's kind of a global market. So the carbon market is global. Social is a local market because the issues of Naples is completely different to the issues of Berlin or the issues in Sheffield or even within London. Knightsbridge has different problems than Barking. So I think the understanding that social is local is, I think, a very important. I mean, it sounds a little bit obvious. Okay, social is local, but it's actually was a big learning for us. And that's why we think that in this entire kind of ESG sustainability discussions, cities need to be much more involved because they know what their citizens need. They have a lot of the contacts and the relationships and the perspective on the ground. And it's not the governments which sit in a capital or the European Union which sits in Brussels or the World Economic Forum which sits in Davos or banks or consultancy firms. What does KPMG from London know what is needed in Brighton?
Right. Who do you think does it best? Sort of that devolution to a city level or a regional level?
I mean, look, I mean, if you talk about best, I mean, there is cities which do it's not an award show here. I would say there is kind of rays of light in a lot of different places. The question is, how do you institutionalize it and how do you get, a lot of this, it is psychology because people think, sustainability is a burden, it's a cost. What does it really bring? I think, that, it's a question of perspective. But I mean, look, Portland has done great work. Amsterdam has done great work. In Berlin, we're working on a project. If it goes through, it's going to be incredible, right on Alexanderplatz in Berlin. So I think to say like which cities, I can tell you one experience maybe. I've worked a lot with Berlin and Amsterdam in particular. And the Berlin people are struggling for several reasons. I think maybe it's because of the Second World War and this kind of collective guilt of the Germans, the federalism of Germany, their kind of perfectionism to make things perfect. And working with Amsterdam, for example, they're much more adventurous. They are much more exploratory. They're willing to fail. If you would have asked Christopher Columbus would have never left to discover America if they wouldn't have said, like, just find out what's on the other end. The Germans, if they don't see land on the other end, they don't even start. And I think I have to say, in working with the people in Amsterdam has been a real revelation. And, we're all Europeans, we're very similar, but the culture in City Hall, the difference, it's like night and day. It's been incredible. It was a great experience working with the people in Amsterdam.
Right. Because I know from a UK perspective, sometimes local authorities feel that we don't get delegated powers down to cities in this country the way that others do. I've been to Portland in Oregon, and they have some fantastic local, again, going back to environmental sustainability, they have local rules like every new development has to deal with all its stormwater on site, which in the UK, bringing in a planning rule like that would be almost impossible for one city to do it alone. Mm-hmm. So is sort of devolution of power, is that a deal breaker from your point of view, or?
Well, I think we need to discuss kind of like a few bigger questions here, because I mean, if you say Portland, and this is the same thing for me, I think Portland does a great job, but Portland is in America, which is maybe one of the most capitalistic countries in the world, but it still works, So I think it's really about, we need to ask ourselves, what is social, you know? Because I think in our day, in our time right now, the problem very often is that social decisions for social are made on a cost benefit analysis. But a cost benefit analysis, so Chekhov said, like, what's the price of what's the price of a tear of a child? So, social impact you can't measure with a kind of cost benefit analysis. The next problem is that we live in a world where timelines have really been shifted towards economic performance, and that's a problem. So, give you an example. So, politicians and real estate developers, they only think in 3 to 5 years, but when they built churches, buildings 150 years ago, these buildings are still there today, and they look more beautiful today than they were looking. Today, when we build something, they last maybe 30 years, then we have to throw them away again. And so it's a question of timeline and our perspective. So I'm working now with a open real estate fund in Germany, and their perspective is 30, 40 years. Yeah. It's a completely different way of working than if you work with private equity, for example, So I think time has gotten a real problem. So a lot of CEOs, they just want their bonus and then out, and then they don't care. Cities or governors or mayors, they just want to be re-elected. So time is an issue that we don't have a long-term perspective anymore. Another question is, democracy is a problem and media is a problem. I think politicians are really under attack in the sense of, I think we should give politicians the right to also make mistakes, So I think media is a huge problem. And then, of course, now looking at the cost of living crisis and how the world is kind of shaping right now, economic growth versus social impact is a huge clash, because a lot of businesses will say, yes, we want to do something for the environment. Yes, we want to do something for social. But right now we can't afford it because the economic framework is getting more tight. And but then here I say again, but if you continue like this, it's going to get worse and worse and worse, and the problems are getting bigger and bigger. So there is kind of bigger questions, and maybe the last one, which is I'm dealing with, in which she just mentioned, is the bureaucracy. Like, it's the world has come to become too bureaucratic. There's too many layers. I think 50% of the global tax literature is in German language. It's impossible for a kindergarten to do their tax returns because its administration is so complicated. And I think we need to almost I would almost say, like, social equals less bureaucracy, because if we would make lives like, over the last 75 years without a war, big war in Europe and world war. I mean, we have wars, Ukraine and so on. But I think bureaucracy is a real hurdle to make our world more environmentally and socially sustainable.
Yeah. And is there a particular trend on that? You were talking about the sort of short-termism of the politicians and the electoral cycle and chief executives and their career cycle as well. It's a frustration of mine sometimes we talk about cathedral building, but it's either people will do something in a very short term, or else they'll kick the can down the road and say, well, if we're doing a I don't know, net zero by 2050 target, then that's somebody else's problem to work on between 2045 and 2050. So it's the time frame thing I find a very big challenge. So I don't know whether you've cracked the problem in any way, or you find ways of making it work better.
Well, look, I mean, the CSRD and the kind of, the directive from the European Commission goes into that direction to put a framework around this kind of transition towards becoming more sustainable. I think the challenge is just, in my opinion, it's that it's very much driven by regulation and not incentives. So, so I've been on a kind of a little bit of a book tour in Germany. Because we did this publication with the City Science Initiative. And when you talk to people in Germany and ESG and the CSRD, they're not talking about what this potentially means for their business. And so they only talk about the regulation. When am I outside the regulation, inside regulation? Where can I get penalties and stuff like this? And then actually, Dominik Stolz, who's from one of our partners, GSK, said something really interesting. He said, like, look, in the end of the day, especially, I mean, the E is done to a certain degree. That's manifested and it's priced in and it's all of that. But the S, you know what? Right now, the S categories are the criteria is not really defined. So if you're a business and you say like we're into education or we're into sports or we're into kind of music for children or whatever it is, you can actually shape it the way you want that it fits into your corporate social responsibility strategy.
Yeah.
Because right now, this is an opportunity to really kind of do something without having too much regulation and to drive out of the garage before actually all the kind of these criterias and kind of definitions come in. And, you know, the sad part is that, you know, I mean, in the United States, there's a huge kind of trend against ESG because, you know, they want to deregulate and they think it's just another tax, which, you know, from an American perspective, I might understand that. And in Europe, you know, they just want to add more folders of kind of, I mean, look, PwC and the Big Four, they see ESG as a huge business opportunity because what's actually happening is you as an entrepreneur, you know that on the 1st of January 2025, now you have to do your first non-financial reporting, but you don't know what to do. So you're going to call one of the Big Four and say, can you help me? They're going to create a brochure with a black child, Asian child, and a white child waving at the camera.
Yeah.
And it says sustainability report, 300K go to PwC or whatever, who it is. And in the end, if you put the 300,000 into a football pitch for kids,
Yeah.
you would actually change something. And this is a little bit what Marina Mazzucato, or not very much what Marina Mazzucato is talking about from UCL, where she says, like, you know, why don't we do stuff rather than kind of shifting the responsibility to consultancy companies who do smart charts and to give you the stamp? And this is where we're lacking leadership, you know, because I think, especially social, I mean, we need leaders to do it. And I think a great example of a really lost leader is the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, because he doesn't even speak out. I think Meloni in Italy is, you know, I'm not in line with a lot of her political views, but she's actually not doing a bad job. And so I think Keir Starmer in the UK, let's give him the chance. But I think, you know, these things need leadership. And I think we all agree at this point. That's why, you know, all these parties to the far left and far right get so many votes and so much support, because, you know, in the middle, we have kind of lost a little bit our kind of vision, leadership and all of these things. And without that, you won't be able to change. It's impossible. Somebody has to call the shots. It's like I always say, it's like when you do a party and 20 people of the party, everybody gets a vote what we eat, you always end up with French fries. At some point, somebody needs to decide what we're doing, and hopefully kind of in a collective, synchronized decision process. But at some point, somebody needs to decide.
Yeah. And you've coined a phrase I haven't heard before, social smoothing. Which you liken to greenwash in terms of the CSRD
that actually
regulations.
That doesn't actually come from me. That comes from Professor Dr. Jan Kerberg, because we're thinking a lot about the social element, and especially in the kind of city real estate environment, the S is the next big thing. And I think, you know, the S is a huge opportunity, because our strapline is places people love perform better. So you know, places which are loved, people go visit more, so there's more traffic. So theoretically, the rents are higher, the streets are more vibrant, there's more diversity. You know, the restaurants are doing better and stuff like this. Versus the places which are not liked, so places people love perform better. But you know, there's the danger. What has happened in the kind of environmental categories, the greenwashing, that a lot of social smoothing. So this brochure I was talking about, where the children are waving, that would be a social smoothing initiative, you know. Yeah. And of course you can do social smoothing. I've worked with companies, they do their business as usual. The only thing, they had a picture on their homepage with the buildings around the park, and now they've changed the buildings around the park, which has the shape of a heart. And that was the entire initiative in kind of changing social environmental. They're doing business as usual. And the question is, if you hit them hard with more regulation, I think you will get in the market much more kind of resistance. And if you would incentivize, and that's why I think the data element is important, we need to start somehow measuring or creating the criteria what social means for places. So I think in central London it's slightly different, but I think from borough to borough it's already different, to cities in different countries. And we need to define that so that there's somehow a measurement, but a localized measurement scale to see like if people are doing a good job or not a good job. And I think in the end, cities need to reward these businesses who do that, because cities, they know what is needed, and it's not the consultancy company which sits maybe 400 or 500 miles away.
Yeah. And just while you were talking there, I was thinking of, the overlap between environmental and social sustainability in Paris, and the transformation of central Paris in the last decade or so, which is quite extraordinary. The way that the car culture has basically been eradicated with surprisingly little resistance that I can see from here anyway.
Agreed.
And I don't know whether
it's the outside view. It's the outside view.
But I don't know whether it's replacing car parking spaces with street cafes that did it. That people, because that makes a place, Central Paris far nicer to walk around now than it was 10, 15 years ago, in terms of placemaking. And obviously, cycling is much more prevalent, and public transport is getting such a boost out of it as well. And we just don't see the car clogged streets that were there, as I say, 15 years ago.
Well, look, I mean, this is a big discussion right now, for example, with Sadiq Khan to kind of pedestrianize Oxford Street, So, I mean, a great example again in Berlin. They kind of pedestrianized Friedrichstraße, which was supposed to be the Champs-Élysées of Berlin. And what the council has done there, they just basically closed down the street, put a couple of benches there, disaster. Because they didn't include the local retailers, the local residents and stuff like this. If you do something like this needs to be really kind of, you have to take all the stakeholders with you. In the end, somebody has to decide what we're doing. But I think just to say like we're pedestrianizing this without kind of involving the people who are actually the stakeholders of that street is impossible. And you know what? The truth is, if you think that people from the Middle East, for example, come by bicycle to Selfridges, I'm not sure. There's going to be a huge cultural shift necessary to make that work. So I don't know. I think, one needs to look at examples where these things have been successfully done. But I think what's important is here to take all stakeholders along onto this journey, and not just kind of come again with regulation. It's going to be pedestrianized. And then people who sit there, who have maybe had their shops for 40, 50 years, they're not being even involved, So to do something like this needs not only to kind of change the regulation that cars can drive through, there needs to be a campaign. I think a great example in placemaking is actually, in fact, already Oxford Street, which goes east-west, and then Regent Street, which goes north-south. And Oxford Street right now, personally, I think it's a disaster, because basically everybody does what they want, and Westminster Council is not really intervening. And Regent Street, which has been highly curated, Crown Estates, it's heaving, it's a great experience, and actually just shows you, they're meeting at Oxford Circus, how placemaking can be done in a completely different way. And I think Regent Street is a great example, how kind of we all talk about the experience economy, how cities and real estate need to be part of the experience.
Yes, it's interesting what you said though about placemaking and cycling, because going back to Portland, they very much worked with businesses, and the first thing they did was put in cycle parking outside shops, and then the shopkeepers found that that people coming by bike could, one car parking space could take 8 to 10 bikes, and that those people were tending to spend more money locally. So they definitely found that there was a win-win for business on that, of shifting from a car culture to more cycling culture. So,
but you know what? One has to also say Portland is a very kind of consistent kind of, the audience in Portland the Portlandians,
Yes.
Portlandia, the TV show, there is a certain ethos in their society. I think London is much more diverse, and therefore it's much more, I think, challenging than in Portland. But I agree with you. In Portland, they have done a really kind of holistic approach to take everybody on the journey. So before they bring more bikes, they've spoken to the shop owners to get the bicycle stands there. So it was a real kind of collaborative approach to say, like, this is the big vision. And there was a clear vision there. And often, I think this is lacking from politics for whatever reason. But and maybe another last example, which is like the example of the bees. If a bee finds nectar, they go out and fly. 80% of the bees fly this way. 20% of the bees fly the other way to see where there's maybe new opportunities and to find nectar. And I think so. This innovation, 20% of bees are 100 million years old or whatever. Innovation is built into their kind of society. And I think this is what's lacking for us right now, because we're all kind of just by kind of an economic cost benefit, we're kind of moving in one way without looking at a bigger picture. And, innovation and trial and error is really my favorite example is like when John F. Kennedy said, we're flying to the moon. They put food people and clothing people and textile people and all these people together in a room. And why don't our eggs don't stick at the frying pan anymore? It's because the food people talk to, the rocket people, and suddenly we have Teflon in the frying pan, and this is where innovation happens. And if we only live in silos, it's going to be challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I'm just, that change management we were talking about there, engaging the shopkeepers, and whether it's in Berlin or Portland or wherever it might be, is, when you're dealing with, I do a lot of work engaging people within organizations. In a way, that's quite easy because you've got a captive audience, and there might be a couple of sort of tribes within the organization, but you don't have the full diversity of people as you were talking about London. But I suppose, do you have any insights into public engagement on these issues for change? How to get people on board for change?
Well, look, I think, there is, as I said to you before, I think, one of the tools to do that would be to get better data. Because, we all say, like, the politics have their agenda, the business have their agenda, the local community have their agenda. But if you would see on a kind of a data level, what kind of I would say, cross-sector opportunities are, I think we always say, like, we have this data tool called Apollo Impact Compass, where we measure social impact, social change, social needs. And we always say, we call it the Switzerland effect. So if you create almost a Switzerland where we all can come together and agree of what is needed, you can align people much better. I think the problem today is, look, I think in Washington, you have, I think, double the amount of lobbyists than politicians. It's very difficult to align these different interests and needs. And I think, if you would have a platform where these partners can come together. And so, as you said, captive audience, that's, I think, one way maybe where we can make change. And the other thing is, there's a lot of coming back to property, because I know that's where I come from and where I know you can do great things with property. They've done great stuff in Canada Water, where they basically kind of funded small kind of sports organizations to see, like, what happens if you support the local girls judo club, then, the rowing club, the skateboarding club, to see what happens. And now they're creating basically like a sports facility out of kind of all these different little communities. I think there's great examples. We don't have to, it's not going to happen that there's a big bang and we change the world. But I think, the challenge is, if we don't have good examples where we can say, like, well, if they have done it, maybe I can do it. So we need to create innovation by example. And I think I want to encourage everybody with this kind of CSRD and ESG subject, which for a lot of people is unclear. It's a huge opportunity to create something really unique, because the market will not penalize you if you do great work. It's actually, you will benefit from it. So this is where I said from the very beginning, we need to shift a little bit from kind of regulation, or like, to incentivizing. And I think, the market, if you do something great, it will be recognized.
Yeah. I was just thinking as well, because obviously on the environmental side, on the E, a lot of it's based on science, whereas S is almost by definition more subjective. And what frameworks do you use on the S side? Is it the Sustainable Development Goals, or is it another set of
Yeah, I
criteria
mean,
that you're designing places around?
yeah, I would say it's a mix. Like, it comes, of course, from the the SDGs, and the S right now. I mean, there's the CSRD framework, but in the end of the day, if you want to kind of untangle it slightly, what you could say is over the last 5 years, social was always something which is more kind of organization inwards. So like, as we talked about the bicycle stand, but for the employees, a gym, better food, organic food, that kind of thing. So it was more like organizational inwards. But actually what's happening now, the more it's kind of matures, I think it's also about kind of what is the impact of your building or your project or your factory or your company within the kind of public benefit in the bigger scheme. So there's stuff like, public spaces, connectivity, social cohesion, jobs. Migration is a big subject. How do we deal with migration? So I think in the beginning, social was very much seen. I remember that some CEO told me, yeah, he's into social because he's dealing with the employees' health in his company. And then we kind of drilled down. It's like, okay, what did he do? He built a jacuzzi on the roof of his building where he kind of sometimes sits on the weekends with his employees in the jacuzzi sipping champagne. So that was for him social. So I think, this is, it's maturing. And I think, it goes more from kind of organization inwards. So making it a better workplace for my organization, which to be honest with you is more for me anyway, a governance thing, not a social thing, to kind of more like the public benefit. How do businesses impact the area they're in a positive way?
Mm-hmm. Yes. One of the examples I've seen of that was in Stockholm, and this is again going back quite some time when I visited there as a part of their Green Capital celebration, Green Capital of Europe. And I noticed that all the taxis were alternative fueled vehicles. And I asked some of the local authority officers at the event, how they brought that about. And they said it was mainly through businesses only booking green taxis. Mm-hmm. And then obviously, if the big users and the big buyers are only booking green taxis, then it means that you and I as individuals who don't have the same buying power when we're standing in the street trying to get to the station, it trickles down to us as well. So I thought that was a wonderful example of...
and there's a great example in the real estate world for that, because, so for example, big developers, what we're saying is, these companies who rented an office in your development, they have to be they're ESG regulated. But if you set up your development in a way that when they move in, all the boxes are ticked, it's basically an advantage for you that people rent office space at your place versus another place. So it's a little bit the similar thing. You do almost like a B2B approach, and you actually configure your office and your kind of like your commercial real estate assets in a way that it's already basically you get the certificate with moving in, you're done. You can save the 300,000 for the big consultancy firm to do your brochure because it comes as part of the service. And I think this is a similar approach, and I think that's actually very smart.
Yeah. But then there's the challenge if you try and design. I was thinking immediately of Western Harbour in Malmo, which they tried to design as a low car-free neighborhood, and then had to retrofit a multi-story car park on it because the incoming residents weren't as keen as being as car-free as the vision. So I again around place making and there are those challenges, aren't there, that the people who are going to use the places mightn't fit the vision. You mightn't have the same vision as you have as a developer.
Absolutely. And you know what, again, when we talk about social, we're talking about a lot of kind of soft factors, not hard factors, and, to bring in another soft factor, beauty. Beauty is a very important thing. I mean, I worked with the former curator from the Hermitage Museum Dr. Terry Morell, he always said like beauty, beauty, beauty. There was always like, beauty, beauty, beauty. But you know what? Why do we go to Venice? Why do we go to Paris? Why do we go to the Maldives? Why do we go to certain places, cultural places, Canterbury for this church? Because of the culture, but also because of beauty, of the architecture, of all of these different things. And I think, if you look, for example, like what Peter Barber is doing, the architect here in the UK, he does social housing, and I would move in immediately. I think they're amazing. And like, why? We underestimate how important beauty is. And if you look at a lot of city developments, new buildings, I think it's alienating. I don't want to live in there. I don't, it looks soulless. It's all kind of concretey and glass. And where's humanity in that architecture? And I think we underestimate how important beauty is. I mean, there's a reason I live here in West London. A lot of people always come to this area because they say it's so beautiful. Why don't they walk around in the city? Because it's not so beautiful, to be honest with you. And one forgets that beauty is actually a key driver.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Right. I've taken up a lot of your time this morning, and thank you very much for all your insights. But as a sort of final question, if you could change one simple thing about, local social sustainability, what would be top of your list?
Yeah, we talked about leadership. So if I would have the one thing, like, there was this TV show where I watched as a kid where this princess always kind of, when she turned the ring, her wish came true.
Yeah.
Die Märchenprinzessin was called, the fairy tale princess. What if I could do something is I would deregulate and kind of put regulation slightly at a stop and incentivize companies who do a good job. And just to see how the impact is going to change, because my feeling is right now we do more and more regulation and burden for the businesses rather than incentivizing them to perform something. And if we get that I would love to kind of have a little bit like a dictatorship in a council for 2 years, to kind of change everything. That's what I would do, and see if that actually works better, because I believe if you incentivize people, so if I tell my kids, if you don't do this, you can get the iPad for 2 hours, usually works much better than the other way around. So I think it's human nature, and with human nature, we're back to social.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. On that note, I think it just leaves me to thank you for joining us today, Florian. I think that was a fascinating romp through a huge number of issues about place-based sustainability. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth. Thanks for having me.